The companies that are the best at attracting people typically are really clear about who they are, what their culture is like, the type of feedback processes they have, who they're looking for and why, and like what they stand for as a group. But like being clear about who they are then attracts people who are a good fit with that culture. And so it's less about how does each side conform and like try to be the thing the other side wants. It's actually much more about like, how do we each understand who we are as a job seeker, as a company, and then attract the people who are looking for that, because like that leads to a better actual match.
Hey, Anthony, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. So I know you're founder of Next, and I know a little bit about Next Careers, that you're this community of, I'll call it tech movers, shakers, people who don't want to just let their careers happen to them and who want to intentionally plan their next career chapter instead. Did I get that right? Tell me more about what you're doing.
I love that. I don't usually use movers and shakers, so I might start incorporating it. Yes, but you hit it spot on. It is very much people who want to be intentional about their next career chapter, and I would say like the common thread is everybody's entrepreneurial. So it's like the questions that entrepreneurial people think about on like, should I found something or join somewhere? Do I want to build a fractional portfolio? Maybe I want to start an angel syndicate. Like, should I start investing? Like all of these things that are pretty unique to this type of persona. That's like a space. It's a space for that group to figure things out together. But yeah, it's all about like intentionality around our careers.
Very cool. Now, I know you've been building Next for a bit over a year now, but from what I've heard, the story goes back. You've got some cool on-deck experience. You've worked for some VC funds. Maybe take me all the way back. Tell me about like what happened to get us to where we are now with you founding this company.
It is so different. And I'm like, Elliot, watching myself on the screen with like a smile. And I was like, wow, I've now been doing this type of work around like entrepreneurial job search and career stuff for 5 years. And have broadly gotten to like smile most of that time. Like, of course, there are ups and downs on like every entrepreneurial journey, but it's like broadly been really positive because it's like the thing that I want to be doing. And then like the chapter before that was very different. And I definitely didn't smile as much as at work. And so I spent 11 years at Goldman Sachs after college. And so like really different life and profession, and broadly had a really positive experience at the firm. It was, I think in many ways, like it is an amazing professional like underpinning of like everything that I do now is in many ways because of like the skill sets that I developed at Goldman, and did a bunch of like things in different cities. So spent 7 years in New York, a few years in London, and the last couple of years in LA. And it was actually my final, I think of it as like tour of duty, honestly, at Goldman. I started spending a lot of my like nights and weekends volunteering outside of work. And part of it was like, I knew I wasn't super happy where I was, but I wasn't sure what else I would do. And so I found a bunch of organizations that I enjoyed spending time with. And it was one of those that was focused on career mentorship that really, in many ways, inspired me to like leave my whole career behind and jump into career development, but like way more specifically within that job search. I just find transition interesting. Like it's all about what do we want to do in the future? And then how do we paint a picture of our background that like gets us that thing? And so the last 5 years has been a mix of starting a couple things of my own that didn't work out after Goldman for the year and a half after that, as a lot of people do, of like test out some different ideas, and then worked at a startup called On Deck to build everything we did for job seekers there. So I think we had about 1,000 people go through the program that I built to help get jobs at startups. So like amazing career chapter, and then was at a VC firm leading their talent function for a period of time in order to better understand like the company side. I'd only worked with job seekers since leaving Goldman, and so wanted to better understand the company and the venture side of talent. And then, as you said, Next for 1 year. So that's the journey, but big transition from finance into startups.
What got you to, I guess I'm sure there was some sort of aha moment. There's like some kernel of what Next was born from that you built up to. How'd you get there? What were the things that you picked up along the way?
Yeah. In many ways, I'll have to credit my on-deck experience. So the program that I built was called the First 50 Fellowship. And so it was the first 50 people at a startup will determine if that startup's successful or not. And I joined the team when probably like 15 or 20 of us right after we raised seed. And then I was a member of the community, of the founder community, as I was building something else, and then kind of pitched the founders of OnDeck and like, hey, we should do this for job seekers. And so joined the team to like scope it and build it. And then spent the next couple of years working on that. And a lot of what we do in Next is kind of inspired by that journey of like actually building community for people in transition. And so that was kind of like the nugget, that was the kernel. And then deciding to do it in a few ways that were intentionally different for Next. One is that it's for more tenured people. So I just personally really like working with people who are a bit further along in their career. It's like more interesting problem solving. And so we're like 50% mid-career, so broadly 5 to 15 years experience, and then 50% exec level. So I like that more tenured. And then also it's Next is bootstrapped, which is actually a big influence in how we decide to do everything, because we don't have to hit certain growth rates. There's no like, how do we maximize the number of people in the door? I like that we get to bring in a couple hundred people per year who I also really want to enjoy spending time with, because like this is how I'm choosing to like spend this career chapter. And so I would say that's like the kernel. And then what's a little bit different than like why I decided to do it in this model versus kind of a venture-backed model.
Cool. That's very cool. So you're helping pretty senior people find incredible jobs. I'd love to have this conversation, sort of have two conversations in parallel. One, how do you help those people approach the job hunt process? How do you help them? I don't know. I imagine they're stringing jobs together. We're not just thinking about one job at a time. And then selfishly, the other side of that coin, how do I stand out as an employer trying to hire these incredible people? How do I vie for the best candidates? How do I make sure that I'm positioned in a way that's going to attract that sort of talent and help them grow, and et cetera, et cetera? So maybe to start, tell me about, what do these people come to you with? Like, how are you finding these people that you're helping, and what do they come in looking for? Because I imagine what they look for and what you give them might be a little different, if I had to guess.
I love it. That's awesome. Definitely a few threads there. So I'm happy I can share some thoughts and then can dig into any of them in more detail. I guess first on like how to help people. I think that in my observation is that the biggest, when people start a job search, the natural thing that we all do is we start reaching out to our network and we start applying, right? We move into execution mode. Sometimes it's like, oh, I'm going to update my resume and then I'm going to do these things. And what I've actually seen is that's the exact wrong approach for somebody like early in the figure it out process. They are oftentimes like burning those potential options they might have because they weren't ready yet to actually have that conversation. And so spending more time up front, like figuring out, what do I actually want? Like, what am I looking for in this chapter? And then how do I tell my story so that I actually like land that thing that I want? Doing that earlier rather than like throughout the process tends to result in just an overall faster process. And so I would say that's like the first thing on like how to help is like, go fast. I guess, what is that? Go slow to go fast. Like actually take the time to figure out what we want first and really do that like reflection and that processing and the planning, because it makes the whole process more efficient. And then as I guess a component of that, which is like the other thing that I would say I see people just like go wrong in the process, is they try to be too broad. It's oftentimes when we're figuring out what's next, we don't want to count anything out. Like we want to make sure that we are trying to be everything to everyone, because we're like, oh, that role could be cool, and I want to make sure I'm positioned for it, but I'm also interested in this other thing. I see that go wrong a lot of times, especially in the current market. Like right now, there's just so many job seekers that a company can check all their boxes. And so I think the better approach, and what I've seen kind of work for like many hundreds of people now, is actually being more scoped, more narrowly scoped, and then kind of testing out these different potential pathways. Typically results in a faster overall process. So it's like, instead of like, I can do a lot of different types of jobs, I'm interested in any stage company. There are these 8 different sectors that I'm interested in, or I'll do any sector except XYZ. It's like actually being like, I'm looking for a VP of product role at a Series B health tech startup. That's super powerful, because then that Series B health tech startup is like, oh, wow, we need that exact person. like this is the person we need. And so by more narrowly defining the thing that's most likely and in line with what we want, we just make the whole process so much faster. And then let's say it doesn't work. Like the market is telling us like they don't need that, or maybe we're not the right fit for that thing we're looking for. Then take that guidance and kind of test out a different hat. Like try something else that might be adjacent to it, but like really getting narrow. So that's the first piece on like how to help people and like where oftentimes people need some correction. Does that? I can talk about the employer side too, but does that make sense? Anything there that makes sense to dig into in more detail?
Do you think like are the days of the generalist kind of over, or is it just over at those later stages once we get to the more senior level roles where, in my case, if GC were to fail and I were to go out and look for a product management role, I do think of myself as a generalist. My startups have been in ad tech and health tech and now in like productivity collaboration. And I jumped all over the place while I was at Meta. Do I need to pick a lane if I'm to go and look for a new role?
I don't think the role of the generalist is over, whether that's like true generalist or like generalist within a function, like you're describing, like in product. But it's a harder search because it requires more like personal reflection and storytelling. So it's like, if I could do many different things, which like, the types of people I work with are generally in the very fortunate position that like they can kind of chart their own path, right? Like they can decide this is what I want next. And so if that's the like world is my oyster type thing, narrowing it, especially for a generalist who is excited about lots of stuff, is much harder. But it makes and it requires a bigger focus on storytelling of like getting really crisp on like, here's who I am, here's how I formed this, here's what I want, here's why. They can still be in a more generalist function. Like they don't have to pigeonhole themselves or like go down one route, but they do have to be really clear about like what they want and why and how their background tells that story. So it's just a different problem. But no, I actually think generalists can be super powerful in organizations because they tend to think non-linearly about problem solving, which is really effective at most startups. What I see on the general side is that early stage, like probably like seed series A, I oftentimes see one like non-technical generalist who comes in. Many like it could be called a chief of staff, could be called biz ops, could be called something else, but oftentimes there's at least one person in that catch-all bucket. And then as startups are getting closer to growth stage, they still have the generalist or they have the need, but oftentimes it's within a functional area, like you were saying, like a product generalist or somebody else who can kind of like slot in a lot of places. Is that helpful? Is that how you think about it too, or have you looked at it differently?
Well, hopefully I don't have to look for a job anytime soon. So I'm trying not to think about it.
Fair.
So, but that all makes sense to me. And then maybe again, flipping to the other side of the coin. So what I am thinking a lot more about right now is from the employer perspective and how to attract these types of candidates. So is it the inverse of what you just said, of being able to really crisply position myself that, I am looking for this person and we are this stage and these are the things that we can offer you. And if you have these skills, is that kind of right?
It is. And I would even go one step further and say the companies that are the best at attracting people typically are really clear about who they are, like what their culture is like, the type of feedback processes they have, who they're looking for and why, and like what they stand for as a group. It doesn't have to be a mission-oriented organization. It doesn't need to be, but like being clear about who they are then attracts people who are a good fit with that culture. And so it's less about in my opinion, it's less about how does each side conform and like try to be the thing the other side wants. It's actually much more about like, how do we each understand who we are as a job seeker, as a company, and then attract the people who are looking for that? Because like that leads to a better actual match.
So I imagine that for both of these, there's some deliverables, some documents. And I'm over here thinking, for the first time in God knows how long, I got a cover letter the other day. I don't know the last time I saw a cover letter. I assume that's not something you're recommending to the people next to use, but what are the things that someone needs in their arsenal as the candidate? What are things that someone is like an employer who's trying to demonstrate all of those things needs as well?
Yeah. I don't spend a lot of time on cover letters, as you said. There are some companies, especially like if somebody's looking at big tech or they're looking at like bigger, like pre-IPO, like those types of companies, sometimes they'll have it there. The challenge with cover letters for a job seeker, at least, is that you never know the like 10% of companies that actually care. So like if they ask for it, you kind of got to have one. The biggest place that people go wrong is they make it just about themselves. Like the job seeker makes it just about themselves when actually it's about like, how would they fit into the company and how can they have an impact? Like every communication throughout the process from a job seeker side should be, how can I have an impact on this organization, on this company, on this problem, whatever it is. And so, no, I don't spend a lot of time on cover letters. But the place that I think most people do overlook and is like the collateral, the deliverable, is actually a LinkedIn profile. People sleep on LinkedIn, and oftentimes they're like, hey, I've updated my resume. It's great to go, good to go. And the problem is it's a private document. Like very few people will ever see our resumes. It's just not a thing that we're sending to everybody. But the LinkedIn profile is like every interviewer is going to see it, but also every person that's networking with us. Like that's the first thing they're going to look at. And so I think that people spend comparatively too little time on their LinkedIn. And that is the most important document that a job seeker will have. And then on the company side, I think, which is like the first part of your question is like how to think about it from as a company. I think that the clarity of who that company is should come through, whether in the job description or like a small careers page in some way. Like it could be a Notion doc. This isn't like a built out big company careers page or whatever. But actually having a Notion doc that maybe it's even their internal teams, like if they're guiding values or other things the team uses, just exposing that and making that available to candidates is really powerful to screen out the wrong candidates, but get the best candidates, the most relevant candidates that much more excited. Like I just hired for my somebody from my team, and my experience as a hiring manager is that like the person who I ended up recruiting and bringing through was like so embodied the things that I shared in like kind of excruciating, painful detail. I was like, here is what we are about as an organization. Here's how we work and the type of person we need. And then like every step of the way, he was demonstrating those things because they were a fit for him too. So I'd say that's really powerful. How have you thought about it on your team? So as you've kind of hired, what are some of those values that you look for at GC, and have candidates stood out in some way as you've been recruiting them?
So in our case, we're at that early stage where we're still looking for generalists for the most part. We're looking for someone that's going to be relatively adaptable, who has that sort of like entrepreneurial passion. If I'm being honest with myself, I think the way that you're describing the people in Next, unless they really want to get some early stage experience, we're probably below them and what they'd be looking for. So in our case, it's kind of this search for diamonds in the rough, and like, can we be the job that's going to help that person up level to get the types of jobs that someone might find through Next? What we're really looking for is resilience. And like we are pre-product market fit, we are pre-revenue right now. So the ability to assess things quickly, make decisions, have spirited debates, disagree and commit, all those sort of like very entrepreneurial building block mindsets are what's so important to us. And I think one of the things that's been a challenge in hiring is there are people who have had that experience and can demonstrate that, but there's probably more people who claim they want that experience and aren't really sure if they are. I remember when I was first pitching investors and fundraising for GC, a lot of people would ask me like, so who would you poach from Facebook? It's like, absolutely no one. Like I was there for 5 years, and very few, I could count on one hand the number of people that I met, at least, who I'd be like, this person would be great in this startup environment. In a lot of ways, I always felt sort of like a fish out of water while I was there because I was a startup. Facebook's really my only real job that I've had, besides working at Venture for a few years and my startups. So it's that we're looking for someone gritty, I think is the way that I would frame it.
No, I think that's real. Have you thought about contract to hire? Like hiring somebody on a temporary basis paid to then assess on both sides if it's a fit before pulling the trigger full time?
There are a few times that I've done that. Actually, our founding engineer was contract to hire, and that worked out phenomenally well. But I feel like that needs to be, it's something that I've always been open to, but that's so much on the candidate as to whether they're open to it. There are people who are allergic to it. There are people who want that. But it's been phenomenally helpful when we've gotten it. What we've tried to do, and I haven't really figured out the right way to do this yet, is like for someone who doesn't have the luxury of doing contract to hire to someone who, has a day job, how do we get a piece of that? How do we get you in the office for like a considerable enough amount of time that we can actually check that box, and so the candidate can check that box? I don't know if I've gotten that right yet. Is that something that you're seeing a lot of people do, especially in these like more senior roles?
Yeah, it's super powerful, honestly. And it goes by different names, right? Like contract to hire, fractional, depending on how it's done, could be a version of contract to hire. I'm a huge proponent on both sides, like candidate side, company side. I actually, for my team, I exclusively hire contract to hire. And I usually do a couple month like stint. It's like time, like in an interview, everybody's on their best behavior, like both sides, everybody's on their best behavior. And you don't know sometimes, like you were just saying, like the person who says they're coming from Meta and they're like, I want a startup environment. And then it's like, oh, wait a second, like I'm going to have to do all this. Like, do I really want to start up? Like having a test run is really powerful in like seeing like who actually is the right fit. And so for somebody who is full-time looking, oftentimes structuring it as like a couple day a week, like what's the biggest problem the company's trying to solve? And how do they have somebody who like plugs in on that like scoped problem is a good way to test. And then if somebody has a full-time job, like they're still at their day job or something like that, they're thinking about leaving, even if it's like a weekend that you could scope or like a couple weekends, or maybe they can take like a day off and it's a Friday and Saturday, whatever it is, like really spending some meaningful time on a project together. It is it's so powerful. There's no other version of it. Like I do case studies as well. That's like a critical part of my process when I'm hiring too. Sorry, my kitten is, as you can see in the background, is having a great and so I love doing some version of being able to like test out like a case study, but then also really importantly, it's like some version of contract to hire, always paid because you got to pay people for their time and their effort. But it's really helpful to me on the like hiring manager side, and I encourage all of like the candidates who I talk to that it can be really helpful and powerful for them too, just assess a company culture from the inside.
What do you think when it comes to another place that we've struggled with that is say like key, I don't know, demographics is maybe the right term for it. So like I, in my case, am my wife is pregnant. We're expecting our kid at any day now, like 2 weeks. And I can imagine that my ability, if I were looking for a role to do that contract to hire thing, to give up a few weekends, to do some nights is a heck of a lot better right now than it's going to be in 3 weeks. Uh, how do you think about that? Like, is that when you're coaching candidates, are you saying like, look, you've got to prioritize this, you need to make the time, or do we have to find other ways for some candidates that might not have that luxury of time to give up?
Yeah. My opinion, like on the candidate and the company side, you're potentially committing to spend a few years of your respective lives working together. And so coming up with a version of like, maybe it's a take a day off work, take a vacation day and go spend it at this company and like work with people at the company. On the company side, maybe it's like coming up with some kind of arrangement that could work. Like, I think being flexible is honestly, it just like saves a lot of potential challenges on both sides in the future. So I would say like strongly, you got to come up with a way. And if now's not the right time, then now's not the right time. Like it's like, okay, maybe there's something else I want to do. I mean, I would say that a lot of this comes from like a position of privilege in the sense of like generally the type of person I'm chatting with has the luxury to be able to decide like the pathways that they want and what they're looking for, whether they're at their current day job or not. And so from that perspective, like, of course it is harder depending on somebody's circumstances, but like I would argue at a minimum, it's probably worth like a half day off or a day off a current job in order to assess a future job and make sure that it's the right fit before jumping in and like potentially not being happy in like that new job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's anybody can fake a dentist appointment if they need to.
There you go. Yeah. I have like an extended doctor's appointment one afternoon. Let's go with that.
What are other, I don't know, common, I'll call it mistakes or like pro moves that you recommend that candidates do that don't do?
So the first thing that really honestly comes to mind is storytelling. I know I like referenced it briefly earlier, but storytelling is the most important part of the job search, especially for somebody mid-career or tenured. As somebody gets more senior in their career and has more things they can draw on, like more experiences that they want to talk about and impact they've had on organizations, editing that down so that it's like, understandable and relevant to what the person wants next is actually really, really hard. And so I find that like the number one thing in my opinion that people do wrong is not realizing the importance of having like a super crisp and clear story that highlights the things they want to highlight for that specific conversation or opportunity. Like just planning it out in advance is useful of like, who is this person? Why am I meeting with them? How might they be able to help me? What roles or opportunities might they be able to introduce me to, or something like that? And then knowing like, okay, I'm going to hit these aspects of my background, really powerful. And the second component to that same thread is the time. So I recommend to people that their intro, tell me about yourself story, can't be more than 2.5 minutes. It's really short. 2.5 minutes is so short. But think about it as like when you hear somebody's story and it starts going on and it's at 5 minutes and it's at 8 minutes and wow, it's at 10 minutes. You're not paying attention. That's just not like, that's not how this works. Most conversations are a half hour. You've now spent a third of it just talking about your background. Like, no way. And so an intentional job seeker who like plans their story in advance, knows what threads they want to highlight for that conversation and can do it succinctly, increases the probability that that person's like, wow, this person's awesome and so relevant to me. And then asks follow-up questions. It makes it more of a dialogue versus just like this very long soliloquy that's not interesting to anybody. And it's much harder for execs because like when somebody's has a couple years of experience, they've done 1 or 2 jobs, it's like, cool, talk about those jobs, right? It's like, it's just a shorter number of period of time to think about. But when somebody has 1 decade, 2 decade, 3 decades of experience, it's way harder to tell a succinct and thoughtful and relevant story.
How do you approach that then? Like, is it in my mind, I'm comparing this to a founder with an elevator pitch. And that like, I'm not telling the whole story of the company. It's what's going to earn me the right for you to ask questions and to tell the whole story over the course of a conversation? Are you coaching people to like a specific framework, or are there hooks, or there's like, I don't know, what's the market size that you need to hit over the head when telling the story of your career?
I love it. That's awesome. And I would say there's a lot of similarity in what you described in the founder storytelling. It's this idea of what are the pieces of my background that are relevant. So I actually, I generally recommend that like from a framework perspective, as people are thinking about their personal stories, they actually start with where they want to go. They start with the future of like, going back to your example earlier, like I want to be a generalist-ish product manager at like a growth stage startup, let's say in the X space, like the fintech space or something, or the B2B SaaS and B2B SaaS. Knowing that and then figuring out what aspects of my own background are most relevant. Like why would somebody hire me for that job? And trace that line, and those are the threads to pull on in a story. And I call it dropping gold nuggets. So when somebody's telling their story, how do they drop gold nuggets where the other person's like, oh, wow, that was interesting. Like, I want to learn more about that thing they said or that thing they did or the impact they had there. So the purpose of this intro story is not telling every detail of everything I did at every job, because that's boring. It's actually like giving them enough information and dropping some gold nuggets that they're like, oh, wow, I want to learn more about this thing because it's relevant to where we're going. And that's a really powerful story, but it's really hard. That's like storytelling, networking, and negotiation are my favorite parts of the job search. They're also, all three of those are the hardest parts of the job search. Like the actual like nailing an interview tends to be like an easier thing, or like figuring out what we want. Like those things actually, in my opinion, tend to end up being a little easier. Storytelling, incredibly complicated.
So you also mentioned networking. I've heard that you have some pretty strong opinions, some strong ideas around networking. I hate networking. I'm a little bit of an introvert. I can turn it on when I need to. I'm turning it on right now for an hour, but I absolutely hate networking. It's New York Tech Week right now here in the city. I have zero desire to go out to these events, and I'm going to have to drag myself out to get myself to do this because I know it's good for me.
Yeah.
What advice do you give around networking? What advice do you give someone like me?
I love it. I enjoy networking. So I definitely come from that perspective, but I also treat it very intentionally. I go to some events and things, but I don't treat that as my like core part of networking. So instead, the first reframe that I think helps people who maybe have the opposite opinion as me, that like they are not naturally inclined to networking, the thing that helps them the most is by, instead of thinking about it as like, I'm going to this conversation and I'm asking something, instead they can go into it and say, how can I figure out a way in these 30 minutes to help the other person? Like the person who I'm also asking for advice, feedback, a connection, whatever. We all have something to give. We all, like, it might be professional, it might be personal. They might say like, I'm about to go to XYZ place. And you're like, wow, I know the best coffee shop in that place where you can go work for the day. Like, find a way to help that other person. And it changes the frame for people who are not naturally inclined toward networking, away from like this cringe thing into like, wow, it's just another opportunity to be helpful to somebody. So I would say that's the first, just like reframing. And then to actually go through the process, I actually bifurcate networking into two buckets. So I think of like structured and unstructured. Structured networking is like, I have an opportunity in mind, or a company, or like something very specific that I'm trying to get in front of. And then like, it's how to do that. It's like how to get in front of those companies. And then unstructured is going to be more of the like, go to a networking event, how people think about networking oftentimes. Like, how do you leverage the network that you've built in order to discover new opportunities or things that you might not have seen? In that second part around like the broad networking, I would say oftentimes we think of go to the people we're closest to. Like the people we've worked closely with, and those people can be amazing, especially if you're trying to do something similar to how they might be able to help. I actually loved your Facebook example earlier, your Meta example earlier, because like, if you wanted to go back into big tech, let's say some future world, you have this big exit with GC and you're like, how do I want to spend my time now? And you were like, I want to go back to Meta. Then probably networking with those people who you worked alongside, amazing opportunity. Like, that's who you want to spend your time with, because they can help with those exits, those exit opportunities for you. But if you were like, hey, I want to stay in startups, I want to build something else, like maybe I want to join an early stage company, those are probably not the right contacts. And so for somebody making a transition, actually like building a new network is important. So strong connections are useful. Weak connections tend to be the most likely to result in a successful job for the next chapter. It's a little counterintuitive. It's actually, it's oftentimes not the strongest connections. It's the people who we meet who identify with us and want to be helpful to us. Because they identify with an element of our background, or they want to support and help, or we meet them in some context where like their guard's down and they're like, oh, I want to be useful to this person. And those tend to be really powerful. Medium connections tend to be less helpful. Like there's no like formal definition, but let's call it like a family friend who like you don't really want involved with your job search, or there's some awkwardness, or it's like somebody's significant other, like stuff like that tend to be least helpful. So that's why I think of unstructured. I think about it as like, how do you identify your strong connections, identify your weak connections, and then really lean into both of those throughout a search, as opposed to like randomness.
So how do you lean into them? Like, what's one of the other things I struggle with is, as I meet these people, as I, connect with people on LinkedIn or whatever, then what? I don't have the memory to even remember that I met all these people, remember to follow up. Are there tactics? Are there tools? Like, what's the formula here?
Yeah, truly, it is documentation for ourselves. I like when I've done this, when I've gone through searches, I just use a spreadsheet. I'm naturally inclined in that direction. There are lots of free tools that are available out there. Actually, Dave Fano, who was on your podcast earlier at Teal, I actually recommend Teal to a number of our people, Teal HQ, because it's like a free tool that people can access that organizes a job search. They do a lot of other things too, but I really like the organization component. And that's for companies, like companies I want to get in front of, like target companies, as well as people who I meet, and like, when do I want to follow up with them? How do I want to follow up with them? And so organization actually matters so much, and everybody's own version of it is different. There's no like, here's the magic way to do it, but in whatever way works for that person, companies and individuals, and having a plan and actually following through with that. I oftentimes when people are in the job search, they're like, okay, Saturday, if they have a job, let's say, they're like, Saturday mornings, that's my time. And then they're like, oh, something came up, like kids need to go to this thing, or like I'm going to a brunch or whatever. What I encourage people to do is like honor the commitment they're making to themselves of like, if it's 60 minutes or 90 minutes on a Saturday morning and that's all you can give to your job search every week and you can't do it, don't just blow through it on your calendar. Actually reschedule that time with yourself for another day to like move things forward. Because like, just like actually starting a startup, like there's no momentum unless you create the momentum. Like especially in this market, we can't assume that like a job is just going to magically fall in our laps.
So this might be the wrong takeaway. I want you to correct this if I'm not hearing this right. if our weakest ties tend to be the most impactful when it comes to these searches, is it less so about being like always on networking and instead about being intentional, that to your point of like, okay, if I want to get a job in big tech and I want to do that, whatever, 2-3 months from now I need to start building those weak ties so that I have some of these relationships that can help power me through that search? Is it short term like that, or do I need to be always networking, always building out the Rolodex, trying to keep up with someone that I met a year ago, or somewhere in between?
Depends on somebody's timeline for like how they're thinking about their career. Like as I work with a lot of people who are deciding if they want to found something or join somewhere. Like 40 of the 100 people in my most recent cohort actually fit that persona, that they were kind of figuring out if they wanted to start something. For that group, for instance, they're tapping into kind of core networks as they're like almost using other people's experiences as inputs to their own decision making on what they want. And so for them, the timeline might actually be like quite short because they're like, well, I want to make this decision so that I can move forward with whatever pathway I choose. For somebody who's at their current company or running their current company or whatever it is, it might be a longer term, like keep relationships warm. Maybe it's the casual like email once in a while, like saw this article and thought of you, like doesn't even require a catch up. You're just kind of staying in somebody's orbit. And then if somebody's actually on a search, for instance, first is being honest with themselves about the timeline of that search, like when is realistic that they want something. And if it's a reasonably short period of time, like in the next couple of months, which most job searches are reasonably just in time, then they're probably systematically doing this every week. And the volume, though, will depend on the time they have available. So like somebody who's serious about job search and doesn't have a current role is probably doing really intentional outreach to maybe a dozen people or more every week who they're then catching up with and spending time with. It's a huge part of somebody's strategy, especially for a tenured role at a startup. These roles aren't posted anywhere. Everything's hidden. And so it's all through networking. And so they got to be like very focused and intentional. If somebody has their job and is like, I know I want something new, but I don't have that much time, it might be they set a goal every week for, I'm going to reach out to 2 people who are from my network or are people I want to reactivate. And the perfect version of a weak connection is somebody who you send an email to with a subject line of like blast from the past, and then they're going to get a small smile on their face. Like that's how I think of, that's a weak connection, right? It's not somebody who knows you super well, but somebody who is going to be like, yeah, I want to help Elliot. Like he's somebody I like, I want to be supportive to. And we all like, everybody's naturally altruistic to some degree. So like assume positive intent and that people want to help us on our journeys is really powerful.
Is it, when you're doing these like blast from the past type emails, what sort of hit rate are most people getting? Like, should you be discouraged if you're not hearing back from a lot of people? Is the expectation that, 1 out of 10 emails are getting a response? You're like, oh, I guess that weak connection is actually a dead connection.
So from a follow-up cadence perspective, I generally recommend that people wait after their initial outreach for like a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then they wait another 1 to 2 weeks. And then if they're not hearing back, at that point, they've sent 3 notes. Just assume it's not going to happen. The person's busy. Don't assume they don't want to chat, but the person's busy. And so maybe reach out again in a year, whatever it is. But it's like, that's not a fit at that time. It's really aggressive when people are reaching out, in my opinion, more frequently than that. Or more than that, like more than 3 times. So like an initial outreach and 2 follow-ups. So that's like mechanics of just like follow-up outreach. Everybody's different, but that's my approach of having seen it happen a lot. As far as hit rate, it will really depend on like the earlier strength of many of those weak connections, right? So like if it's like person I randomly met at an event once and doesn't really remember me, I don't know, that's probably going to be a low hit rate. Try 10 of those and hopefully you get a couple back. But if it's like somebody maybe you worked on a project with on a team previously, like each other, you've worked together, and you send out a couple of those, I would expect most are going to come back, right? As long as you've like maintained some type of positive like reputation with like their circles in some way. I think about it as also like I feel quite fortunate that I get to work with people who are in moments of transition, which is like naturally a vulnerable time, right? And so in many ways, the Next community is really the way that it's grown. So we had the most recent cohort in the spring, we had 750 people apply for the 100 slots. And so it's like become a thing. And like of those 100, the 50 of the 100 we chose to participate were actually referred by program alumni who had gone through the earlier cohorts, because people go through it, they have a great experience, and then they tell their friends about it. And that piece, I think is just really powerful. So the reason I share that is because like I have the very fortunate circumstance of working with people in moments of transition. And then when you help somebody, like think about all the people who have helped you when you were figuring something out, you know who those people are. And so I'm lucky to be on the receiving end of many of those folks. And so they've kind of helped support the community because they want to help the community members, but also help me because I've helped them negotiate or I've helped them do something else in their process. So everybody's network is has been formed in different ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like it's their weak ties, but they have a strength because of their past. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, somebody you helped with a project once is probably much more likely to be like, oh my God, I want to help Elliot in this case when he needs XYZ, than somebody who's like, oh, I don't really remember who this person is. Like maybe if I have time, I'll respond.
You had mentioned a spreadsheet earlier. Any tools that you recommend? Is there a way to make this easier? Is there not a way to make this easier and you just have to bite the bullet and make a spreadsheet and put the effort in? What's your networking stack, for lack of a better term?
Oh, I love that. My networking stack. Honestly, I don't have like a do X on that because everybody's actually quite different. I've had some people who love Kanban style boards and they'll use Trello or they'll use something else to like simulate a funnel. I think Teal uses kind of the Kanban style as well for at least a prior version that I had seen of what they were building. I like spreadsheet because I think that's how I grew up professionally. That's how I think. And so like I literally have a companies tab and a people tab. And then the most important thing in whatever format somebody uses is the follow-ups and the follow-up cadence and having a plan so you don't lose threads. We all like to think at the beginning of a job search that we're going to remember everything. And we don't. That's just not, our memories are not like, are not pictures. Like we don't have perfect pictures. And once we start talking to enough people, as we oftentimes do in a search, we're going to start forgetting some things that happened earlier. And where this comes up is actually back to the storytelling that you asked about earlier. When somebody's being really thoughtful about shaping their story for each conversation, the thing they sometimes forget is that they're telling different versions of their story. It's still them. It's all accurate and real, but it's like, what did I highlight here when I spoke to this earlier person at the same company? And so actually the like more important than like the stack is that not only are they jotting down who they're talking to, what the notes were, and like when they're going to follow up, but actually they're also writing down what they shared, like what version of their story did they go with? Because then the next time they talk to that hiring manager or somebody else from the company, they're actually using that same storyline as opposed to the person being like, wait a second, I heard something else from like somebody else you talked to in this process. And it's like job seekers can't afford to create yellow flags for employers in this market. Like there are just too many job seekers, too few jobs. And so like in some ways, especially in the early stages of the process, the job seeker's job is reducing yellow flags, and inconsistent stories an immediate yellow flag.
Interesting. Yeah, that's I could see how that would really rub me the wrong way if that happened to be or vice versa. One other thing I want to ask about, I imagine that with Next, we're talking about these people that are building a career. It's not about a job, it's about the job and the job after that, and the job after that. When you think about like long-term recruiting, that's something that my investors ask me a lot about. Like, do I have a pipeline? Am I thinking about not the hire that I need yesterday, but the hire that I might need 6 months from now or a year from now? What advice are you giving to candidates, to employees on how to be thinking that way? Because then I'm going to flip that and think about how I can use that to my advantage as an employer.
I love it. This is actually the third time this has come up this week with a founder who's reaching out and being like, I'm not ready yet, but here are the types of roles I probably will need. Is there anyone in the community who I can talk to like start building rapport and also clarify what I want, like what I, as the company, actually want, like what is great for this particular role. So I would say first it comes to scoping, like understanding there's a big difference between like the person who's going to come in as your like business generalist COO to like figure out how to scale the operations versus your head of eng, or like you have a product background. When is the right stage for you to bring in a head of product so that you can be true like CEO, right? Like those are big decisions. And so I actually think by starting for the company to clarify what they want is really useful. Like what actually is that roadmap versus just like, this is a person who's broadly interested in my space. And then once they've clarified that, prioritize probably 1 to 3 of those like pipeline roles. and truly start reaching out and having conversations, whether that's through Next or wherever they know people in their past, through cold outreach, but like try to identify amazing and build that Rolodex, because when they're actually ready to recruit, the likelihood that one of those people is going to be their hire, not super high. A lot of things have to align for it to be perfect timing, but those people will then be like, oh, I've spoken to Elliot twice in the past year. He's awesome. He's now recruiting for this role. I'm in my new role. So I'm not interested, but like, let me go ping several of my friends who are the perfect fit for this. And if you've identified these amazing people, it makes your recruitment process in the future so much easier. And so I guess I answered the company question first. On the job seeker side, it's just the inverse of that. Like, they're building their own pipeline and portfolio of the things they might be interested in the future and the conversations that they want to have. So I typically advise people that if they're extremely time constrained, then of course they need to be thoughtful about like how many conversations they're having and if something's going to lead to success in the short term. But for most people, they can do an extra half hour to like build an initial relationship. And so I actually encourage people to take those calls, even if it's exploratory on the company side, because it's good from a networking perspective that they're on some list that for the future might be a way that they can reach out or help their friends, right? Like, everybody wants to be in the position of having introduced their friend to a job. It feels so good. And so everybody likes that.
Awesome. We normally end an episode asking where people can follow you, where they can keep up with your company. And I want to hear that. But I also, selfishly, I also want to hear, I'm sure there are other resources that you recommend, whether it's books or podcasts or wherever you get your information. So I'd love to hear both. Where can people follow along with Anthony? Where can people follow along with Next? But also, what are your greatest hits that you're recommending to the Next community, to employees, to employers, whoever?
I love that. So I'm at nextcareers.co. And I'm mentioning that the website partly to answer your first question, but also your second, because we just added a section about recent events that we've done. We do mostly private events. We've had about 100 private events in the past year. We do a lot of kind of events for the community, but we periodically do public ones. And there are a couple there that I think will be particularly helpful to anybody who wants to go deeper on some of these topics. One is around like job search strategy. So there's a workshop around job search strategy. And then there's another one on negotiation that I co-hosted earlier this year with Heather from Signalfire and Peter from Carta to talk about like compensation and negotiation trends. And so if somebody wants to go deeper, there's some resources there on the website. And other resources that I really like and I'd recommend. One is actually a founder resource that I recommend to job seekers, which is Roy Bahat from Bloomberg Beta has this article from a few years ago that like I'm probably one of the biggest sharers of on forwardable emails. Forwardable emails are the number one way that people get jobs. And so they're so important. And so Roy has an article focused on how founders should use forwardable emails in their fundraising process. Job seekers should use their own version of that. So check out, look for Roy's piece on forwardables. And then the other resources that I would recommend are actually newsletters. So I find newsletters are extremely effective for job seekers who are looking in specific niches. So like, for instance, if somebody's looking for a generalist, a chief of staff role, or a VC role, the first place I send them is Allie Road Jobs, ROHDE, because she has an amazing newsletter where she kind of highlights these roles every week. And she like scrapes all the ones that are out there and then highlights the coolest ones that are most relevant to startup people interested in those roles. Diversify Tech for software engineers has like an amazing list of like, here are some great roles. So finding the newsletters that are most relevant to our searches, those are actually the best resources, in my opinion, in the process.
Awesome. Anthony, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I'll share this as we close out. There were multiple times that I felt myself reaching for my phone, because if we were just like hanging out at a bar or something, I would have been like trying to take notes over here furiously. And I was like, oh no, it's all recorded. It's all on the podcast. So I can't wait to listen to this one again. Thank you so much for taking time to chat today. This has been great.
I really appreciate you having me on, Elliot. This was so fun. And I love that I got to talk about like job search for an hour. So I appreciate it so much. And I'm excited to follow along. Your episodes have been awesome so far.
Thanks. I appreciate it. All right. Thanks again, Anthony. Have a good one.